being conducted for the World War II Children's Oral History Project. I'm today in Helensburgh with Ralph Risk. Ralph, just for the record, would you please confirm your name?
Ralph Scott Risk.
Thank you. Today is the 25th of August 2020, and we'll just get started if that's okay.
No problem.
I believe that you wanted to start with some background information about yourself, Ralph.
I thought perhaps it might be of interest because I have memories of the war in 1939-45, but I was very young, and most of the memories that I have are really coloured by the people round about me, and particularly my family. And if I explained who I was, where I came from, I thought this might be helpful. I was born in south side of Glasgow to a prosperous middle-class family. My father was a lawyer. He'd served during the First World War for 3 years in the trenches. My mother had very nearly qualified as a doctor. She'd passed her finals in Glasgow University. And in 1917, she decided to give it all up without graduating because her schoolboy boyfriend, childhood sweetheart, got leave from the trenches and they got married and lived very happily, I think, ever after that. As I say, that we lived in Pollockfields. My parents, there were 5 children, of whom I was by far the youngest. And as a result, my upbringing was very much coloured by all of these older people. I think my father's influence was related very much to my life during the war, because being conscious of the war, it was only 14 years after the end of the war that I was born, the First World War. He, I think, saw the looming danger of Hitler and joined the Air Force in 1939 to set up a balloon squadron in Glasgow, which was filled with a bunch of his friends, veterans mostly of the First World War, including 1 or 2 people who'd been in the Royal Flying Corps, very famous photographer, Craigie Annan, who'd been an observer in the Royal Flying Corps, and others. There's a photograph there. I don't know whether you want to add the photograph to the record, because some of the names will be familiar to Glasgow people. So he was very conscious that there was potentially a war coming, as was my mother. And I was at Kelvinside Academy, the day school in Glasgow, from 1938. So 1 year after I joined the school was evacuated from Glasgow on the 1st of September, 2 days before the war broke out. And it was evacuated to WWII Lodge in Arran, which is a small hunting lodge on the west coast of Arran, which was very uncomfortable, although I don't remember very much about it. The school was very much smaller. It was down to about about 60 or 70 pupils at that stage, of whom I was very much the youngest. It was slightly traumatic for me because the 3rd of September marked my 7th birthday. So 2 days after we were evacuated from Glasgow to this as I say, hunting lodge in Arran, it was my birthday. I was given one present, which was a dinky toy set of balloon barrage. And I was deeply upset because the older boys grabbed the balloon as soon as it was opened and used it as a football and ruined it. So my single present for my 7th birthday I never got to use, and I've been looking for one ever since, because it does exist as a dinky toy. We were there just for one term, because it was impractical. It was cold. There was, I think, no electric lighting in parts of the lodge. And at Christmas time we came back to Glasgow. It was again made slightly more dramatic because the night before we were due to sail back on, I think, the Devar, our primary school teacher, Eva Young, phoned the Admiralty in Brodick and said, "Look, I saw a submarine out here. What was it doing?" And they said, "Don't be stupid, woman. Don't trouble us with your imagining." And the very next morning when we were due to sail back, there was a phone call back from Brodick to say, "What did you see?" She explained, and it was a German submarine. And I understand, I mean, my recollection, I don't think it's imagination, that as we were sailing back to Rothsay or to the mainland, whatever it was, a naval ship came alongside and hailed us and said, "We got it." Now, whether it was sunk, whether it was traced, or whether it's my imagination, I have not a clue. I've never actually gone to the Admiralty records to check. So that we decided not to go back to Arran because of submarines and lack of electricity. And we went to Tyne Drum Hotel, where we occupied that for a year or so, until that area was used for the commander training area. So we were chased out of that, and went to Tarbet Hotel on Loch Lomond. As I say, my recollections are scanty. The one thing or two things I remember of Tyne Drum. One was another loss which I suffered, or we all suffered, because if you go out of Tyne Drum Hotel up towards the railway station to the east, there are 2 railway stations. There was a sand pit halfway up, and I think we all lost dinky toys using it as a playground. So if anybody finds any dinky toys, they belong to Kelvinside Academy. The other thing I remember was Mrs. Young, who was an interesting lady. We really didn't know whether she was married or not, but suddenly her husband appeared. And I can remember quite clearly walking down the riverbed in Tyne Drum towards Crianlarich with this old chap who talked about escaping from Moscow in 1917 on the train to Vladivostok. And he escaped from the communists. And I've no means of finding out more. I just have this memory that he did a Dr. Zhivago and escaped from the train. A fascinating person he must have been. Like so many people, you forget to ask, or you don't have a chance to ask again. At any rate, we then went to Tarbet Hotel, where we schooled with, getting down, at the end of the war there was only about 30 pupils. I was still the youngest because there were no additions at the bottom end, and the older boys had gone off to war. As teaching staff, interesting looking back, it was down to 5 or 6. 1 or 2 went off to join the Navy or to other services. I think 1 or 2 may have been conscientious objectors or have been unfit. But they did their best. They taught us all the languages. At this time when we're talking about the difficulties faced by the children who are going to be scarred for life because their schooling is interrupted for a year, I must say, I possibly have been scarred for life. People will tell me that I have been. But when I think what my schooling was like, with one person to teach all languages, one person teaching maths, and one person teaching English, everybody fitting in, doing their best. Classes sizes of 1 or 2. When at the end of the war, I had jumped up a class a year or two because there was nobody else, not because I was very bright, and came down to size when we came back to the main school. But we all coped. And life was not idyllic. It probably was totally unlike a normal boarding public school, because I say there was this very small cadre of about 30 pupils at the end of various ages. It was sheltered. The food was quite reasonable in the hotel. It was normal, I'm sure, rationing food. The only recollection I have is a cordial dislike for tripe, because we were served it once and it was green. I gather what happened was that it hadn't been washed, which tripe should be to get rid of the grass from the stomach lining. And I've never been able to touch tripe again. And have all sorts of other offal. The food was good, always adequate, knew nothing else. We all went up to the little village shop run by Mr. Davidson, where he frightened the living daylights out of us, but we got our sweeties and occasionally bought a biscuit, things of that sort. Not many particular memories, I'm afraid, because apart from the schoolmates who were isolated, the two things I think which possibly would be relevant. One was the day of the Clydeside Blitz. We saw, or one of my classmates saw the bombers flying down Loch Lomond low to get to Clydebank. They'd come from Norway, I think. And one of the boys swears he could see the pilot of the German bomber. And in en passant, they dropped bombs on Inversnaid Hotel, which is a little village on the east side of Loch Lomond. People don't know of it, but I think there were decoy fires in the hills, which was something they did, although at the time it was just said that they'd been burning the heather, and for whatever reason they dropped bombs on Inversnaid Hotel, which was shattered, and the school went over in the Princess May, I can't remember, one of the Loch Lomond steamers, a day or two later to pick up bits of shrapnel and mementos. But on the other hand, we all thought, or did we think back now, if it was Inversnaid Hotel, it might have been Tarbet Hotel, and we might have been evacuated into danger. That was one memory. The other memory was being taken to the railway station, the Arakir Tarbet railway station, and I can't remember which year this was, and watching the King coming off the train, probably to go to the Arakir torpedo unit or submarines, but he was visiting somewhere. We all waved and cheered. That brought a bit of excitement to life. Apart from that, it was as I say, a sheltered existence. Small school, no sporting team events. We did have a local school, the Talbot school. We didn't have much dealings with them, oddly enough. We don't thought the two organisations would have cooperated, but it was very separate. And we had no real dealings with the locals. I think a couple of boys from Attica came and joined us for a year or two. Don't know what's happened to them. Played tennis on the tennis courts at the hotel. And played around, as I say, we played football, soccer, probably five-a-side amongst ourselves. But at the end of the war, we came back. We had come back on holidays during the war. We came back for Christmas, for summer holidays, and lived in danger if there was danger in Glasgow. I don't know why they thought that we had to be evacuated for safety from January to June and from September to December, but back we came, and I think I remember only one lot of raids when we sheltered under the stairs, which are the traditional way of sheltering in these old Victorian houses. But I don't remember anything more than that of the impact of war on myself, except that each of my siblings in turn went off. My eldest sister got married and joined the WVS and worked in Stirling. My eldest brother, or elder brother, went into the Air Force and became a pilot and travelled the world in flying boats. He was a flying boat pilot. His travels left me always anxious to see other parts of the world. I mean, he was based in Ceylon and flew from there to Perth in Western Australia, which at the time was almost Amy Johnston type flying. It was in a Catalina, which is a very long range plane, and it was almost unheard of. He joined the Air Force. Then my second brother joined the Marines in 44 or thereby. He was in Holland and Belgium fighting in Walcheren. My sister, she was tatty-howking and doing various things, and I was still too young to do anything. So it was interesting life second-hand, that so many things happened. The end of the war came, so everybody returned home and set about their life. And really there's very little more that I can contribute.
Could I ask a few questions
Yes, sure.
for clarification? Do you know when you went to Talbot and when you left, the years?
I think I would have gone to Talbot in 1940, September, possibly later. And certainly that was to Tyne Drum. We went 39 till December, we were in Arran. I think we spent about a year in Tyne Drum, and it would be 40 or 41 we travelled to Talbot. And I think we came back before VE Day, but I'm not certain. I could check. So that was the timing of it.
Did you have any concerns about your family who went off to fight in the war?
Not nearly as much as my parents must have had. I'm not sure how far. I don't think my imagination would conceive of my heroic big brothers having trouble. In a way, the fact that Tom was flying boat pilot. He was involved, I believe, in the Battle of the Atlantic a little bit, because he was originally in Sunderland, and I think they were used as anti-submarines before he went out to Ceylon. What he did in Ceylon, apart from woo a wife whom he later married, I don't know, but it sounded like an idyllic life at Kogla Inlet in Ceylon, which I believe is a place now that people pay millions to go and stay, and flying to, as I say, to Australia and places like that. Don't think the idea of danger. I don't know whether he ever saw an enemy plane. He may have done. Brother John, I think I was less aware of what he was doing. It was only really after the event that one realised he'd landed, not on D-Day, but later. And he wasn't involved in Arnhem or anything of that sort. But he was, I think Walcheren was a pretty hairy event, but I knew nothing of that and was not concerned. And my sisters, no, there was no worry. My father, again, no concerns, because although he was in the Air Force, he was based at home. He was up in Scapa Flow, setting up the balloon barrage there to protect the fleet. And then he was eventually invalided out. So no sense of concern. But I'm sure my mother must have been. And the other thing is the horror which 21 years between my father's escaping from the trenches. Horrific, because he was in the Highland Division. He saw a lot of action. And my mother, childhood sweetheart, came home. What they must have felt when their sons were confronted with war. I just can't conceive of how frightening or worrying it must have been for them. That generation who saw 2 wars and had children. None of our children has ever been placed in danger. So it's one of the many things which I think there were 1 or 2 unique generations. My professional career later as an accountant, I was very conscious that a lot of the people with whom I was working had seen life in a way and had much more experience of life than I would ever have. There was even further retrospective. I remember that I mentioned these bunch of cronies. There was a place in Glasgow, the Corn Exchange, where mature businessmen would go for a pie and a pint at lunchtime, what I thought were old men. And this restaurant in the centre of Glasgow had a little enclave behind a curtain halfway in. And a couple of times I was invited to join these old fogies when I was an apprentice. And looking back, I realised that they were all First World War veterans, like these people in the balloon barrage who joined the second time round. And I don't know whether they were ever felt more free to talk amongst themselves about their recollections in a way that none of us heard amongst us youngsters. I don't know anything. I have one brother-in-law who was a Spitfire pilot, and flew rocket Typhoons, which were pretty hairy planes, in the 39-45 war. And I've heard a bit about his career, because he'd fought in Malta, and there have been books written about the Spitfire squadrons in Malta, and I've got a far better appreciation of that than anything of my own family. I find it very sad that so much I could have known about people with whom I was familiar and just never asked, was never volunteered. But that little coterie behind the curtain of elderly gentlemen would be, I suppose, 1950, they'd be 50 to 60, so they were quite old. Not by my standards now, but they lost friends, countless friends. It's, I think, probably one of the most staggering statistics which one doesn't particularly see is the number of the bomber pilots who were killed during the Second World War. And to have been part of that group, there must be shared memories which they don't like to think about themselves, far less to talk about. And these things get lost to history.
Do you think that children were told things about what was happening during the war? Or do you think you were kind of sheltered from all that?
I think sheltered. I don't think anybody bothered to tell us. It was quite apparent. There was this awareness that one or two of the older boys went off, and a couple of the people I had known when I was yay high and they were killed. Didn't particularly talk about it, but now know there was one of them was in midget submarines and tackled the Tirpitz. Not my particular vintage, but and there was another one who was killed, who was a motor torpedo boat captain. That came to us, but that was, we weren't, it wasn't hidden from us, but it wasn't something of which we talked every day. So no, that's why I really feel like I've got so little to contribute in relation to memories of the Second World War, except the fact that it is almost a blank and just a perfectly normal upbringing I had, which may have been slightly abnormal in retrospect, but to me that was life. There was no sense of being different.
When you went back to your family during the breaks from school, did you find that quite a different experience to be in Tarbert?
No, it was just part of life. There was a limited number of people at home. We had evacuees, I'd forgotten that. There was a family from south of Glasgow who were billeted or living in our house, and we gave up part of the house to them by government decree. I don't think it was altruistic by my mother. She was probably quite happy to have the company. There was a rattling in a big old Victorian house, having had 5 children. I was the only one born there, but there were the 5 of us there until in the late 30s. I'm trying to think, my sister was also, my next sister, Shirley, who's got probably far more memories than have I. She was there. My elder sister, got married, I think, in about 41. So she left. And the boys, the brothers, were My eldest brother, Tom, he continued to go to Kelvinside until the day he went to university for a year until he was old enough to join the Air Force. My second brother went to Glenalmond, John. I don't know quite why. I think it was one of his friends was being sent to Glenalmond and didn't want to go without a pal. And my parents were persuaded that John could go there as well. They weren't particularly public school oriented. But so he was home for a first year or two of the war during holidays. Otherwise, it was a fairly empty house. As I say, we only once had shelter from the bombs, which fell far away. Well, that was another, the chap Graham Strachan in Tarbet, the school. His parents were lived in Clydebank. He ultimately became the head of Upper Clyde Shipbuilders and sadly died in a hotel far at Aviemore many years ago. But his parents lived in Clydebank and their house was damaged or destroyed. And I think there was some concern that he might have lost his family. But that was the nearest the war came. We did have another episode I've forgotten. We went during the time at Tarbet, we went through to Aracher and were given a tour of a submarine, which was the torpedo factory on the other side of Aracher, Loch Long. The submarines were occasionally moored there. And I would have liked to know what happened to that submarine and to the crew who showed us over it. But very, very little contact with the war.
What was the submarine like?
Black, oily. I don't know. I think even to an 8-year-old or 10-year-old, as I would have been at that time, I think it was quite confined. I would imagine it must have been enormously claustrophobic. But in those days, submarines were slightly dangerous because it was not long before the war when I think it was the Thetis. There was a submarine which sank in the Gairloch, I think, just round the corner from here. It submerged and never came back, and the crew was lost. So submarines were hairy, were dangerous. But it was filled with machinery, that's all I can say. And don't remember much of it, but it was happened.
Would you be able to describe to me what the balloon barrage, what is a balloon barrage?
Yes, indeed. During the war, there was a lot of bombing, different types of bombing, but particularly what was effective were what were called the Stukas, which were the Junkers 87s, which were low-level bombers. They came across fairly low, went into a dive, and dropped a bomb, pinpoint accuracy. And for instance, at Guernica in Spain in the Civil War, they were responsible for a lot of the killing. And these bombers depended on flying very low. And one of the means of defending strategic targets was to set up balloons outside the thing. There's a photograph there of a balloon up above the Fourth Railway Bridge. And that was set up in 1940. But they were all around various strategic places. And there was a trailer, a lorry, and they filled the thing with hydrogen, and it was hoisted. And the impact on the bombers was not so much the fact that they ran into them, but if you were flying a dive bomber and you knew that there were balloons above you, you knew bloody well that there was a great big cable somewhere that you couldn't see. And as you went into your dive and came out, if you actually touched the cable, you were dead. So it discouraged the average sensible bomber pilot and kept them higher. So that was, I think, the motive behind these. And they were set up particularly at Scapa Flow in Orkney to defend the fleet. In fact, I was just looking earlier about a little plan showing the location of all the balloons in Orkney, which is a hand-drawn thing which was made at the time, which I suspect the Orcadians might be quite glad to see, where these things were, out of curiosity. So these continued throughout the war. And in fact, the other development, my father, once he came back from Scapa, he went down to the balloon research department at Cardington and worked, I think, on the development of balloons to be attached to ships. And in convoys, again, they had these ships with balloons attached to their tails, which didn't deter the submarines, but it did deter the Focke-Wulf bombers, which were otherwise anxious to go low to hit the ships. So that was another evolution of the use of the balloons. This is a photograph of the officers who formed the, I think it was 940th Squadron of Balloons in 1937, or 1938, 39. And they're all elderly, mature people who would not be eligible to go into the fighting forces. Some of them have got decorations and signs showing that they had fought in the First World War as observers and pilots in the Flying Corps. Craigie Annan, who's one at the front, he became a very famous social photographer in Glasgow. Did everybody's weddings and 21st and all the photographs. And he learnt his trade over enemy lines in 1718. I think he got a DSO. But the others were all, say, a bunch of elderly gents who'd seen war and didn't want to see it again, but on the other hand, immediately put up their hands and joined the ranks. And they put up the balloons over, for instance, the Forth Bridge to protect it from dive bombers, and up at Scapa Flow to protect the fleet. And all over Britain there were these balloons to frighten off the dive bombers, including the balloons which they attached to ships, so that the bombers couldn't come up behind low level to bomb the ships without fear of hitting a cable which would immediately down them. It didn't explode or anything, it just, if you lost a wing to hitting a cable, you weren't going to fly very much further. And the pilots were very well aware of that. So it was, I think, a surprisingly effective, if passive, form of defence. All the cities were surrounded by balloons at their strategic points. I've always, says, I continually say, I wish I'd known. I know that my father, I remember here the chap used to be friendly with Ben Locke Spicer. He used to come up to Glasgow after the war and visit. And I've now discovered that, in fact, he was very much involved. He was the chap who designed the site used by the dam busters. When the dam busters were dropping their bombs, they had to fly very low and very accurately. And one of the things they had to find out exactly what line they were on. And there were two buildings on the sides of the lake to simplify the thing. And what they wanted was to be at a certain angle between these. And this chap evolved this little bit of wood in the way of a thing with a nail at each end. And the bomber observer would hold this thing, and the moment the two pins aligned with the buildings, that was the time to drop the bomb. So they had to drop it within 50 or whatever meters as they were approaching the dam. Impossible to judge, but this was the simple mechanism. So whether my father knew Barnes Wallis, whether he knew, well, he did know Ben Locke Spicer, I don't know. He had an interesting life.
Would you tell me about your father, please?
Lawyer, son of a lawyer, born 1891. He played football, amateur football for Queen's Park, the time when they were quite in the first division. Not very often, but he was, I remember years ago, the Evening Citizen, I think it was, had an article by their doyen of football writers on retirement, and he talked about all the people he'd known, Alec Morton, all the rest of the greats of his day, R.S. McCall. And he said, but there was only the fastest man I ever saw, over 20 feet or yards, was a very insignificant footballer called Ralph Risk. He was the fastest person I ever saw off 5 yards. So he played that. But in 1915, when he would be 24, he joined the infantry. He'd been in the reserve, and he fought from there on in the 51st Division, the Somme. I've been to various places he fought. Quite a distinguished military career. He had a couple of MCs, many mentioned in dispatches, and survived, which is the important thing, because I wouldn't be here. But, as I say, in 1917, I think repeating myself, my mother, who was studying medicine, decided to give it all up and marry her childhood sweetheart, which she duly did when he was on leave. And that was the start of the Risk dynasty. As far as it was a Risk dynasty, probably started long before. Because my father was his siblings, quite a number of them, had emigrated to Western states and Canada in the 1890s and 1900s, at a time when they left, and this I've become very conscious, when they left to emigrate, they wouldn't expect to hear, no phones, wouldn't far less see, no cameras, their family again. And when I went off to the States in 1960-ish, just to see the world, because my brothers had done it at Her Majesty's pleasure. I did it in my own. I could place a phone call home, giving advance notice, and have 2 minutes. And that would be it. Now you Skype, you Zoom, and I keep wondering and keep asking grandchildren, what do you think will be the next stage? Will there be transmutation? Or will it be possible to be flown up to a rocket round and down an hour later in Western Australia? I don't know. We live in interesting times. And I think, unfortunately, none of us will live long enough to see the outcome of that conundrum, because the next time there'll be another conundrum, and we all have to live and accept the fact that we've been lucky to see a lot, but we can't see it all. Unless you happen to be religious, which I'm not.
You've actually covered an awful lot of what I was going to ask you. It's a bit frivolous perhaps in light of the other things that you've spoken about, but do you remember ever going to the cinema as a child?
No.
Because in Tarbert there wouldn't have been access.
I think, now that you mention it, that we may have seen what would be an 8mm or a 16mm, but I'm not sure. Somehow I think I remember seeing war films. Now I don't think there certainly wasn't a cinema in Tarbert. There wasn't a cinema in Arrachar. I don't remember going to the church hall or to the church and seeing anything in that regard, no. Well, interesting. I can't remember.
Do you remember the end of the war?
Not as much as I should. I don't think I remember VE Day. I certainly don't remember in any sense of recollection of where I was, what I was doing, VJ Day. I don't remember in any regard the dropping of the atomic bombs which terminated the war. I think I must have been aware of it, but it didn't make an impact, strangely. I think probably, I can't remember the emotion, but I must obviously have been conscious of the fact that I had two brothers potentially in danger. But I'm the wrong generation to ask about all these things because I was just too young and perhaps emotionally immature to have these conscious memories. I'd be very interested to know how many people of 1932 vintage do remember these particular incidents in the way that you'd think that they would. I haven't discussed. I've got very few contemporaries left to ask, but I don't remember discussing with my contemporaries whether they remember that. Just hasn't crossed my mind to ask. It's an interesting question.
Now, you were quite young, so I don't expect you to kind of remember much about these either, so please just answer what you can and just say if you don't. Do you remember anything about healthcare during World War II?
No.
Do you remember anything about...
Sorry, we had a nanny at the school. That's the only... I don't think... There presumably was a local doctor in Tarbert. I don't remember his being called to me or to anybody else. And certainly have no idea of whether it would have been a private practice or how it would have been handled. No. And I don't even remember the initiation of the health service. I was aware of it because I was getting to an age by that stage. But I don't know, in a strange way, I think perhaps the fact that my mother, having taken her finals and had a generation of doctors who were her close friends, Norrie Bruce was our family doctor, who was very close friends, the Bruces, with us. So I think we were protected from any sense of having to send for a doctor. It was just ask Norrie. And same way, optician, Stuart Meacham was a family friend. And when I had to get glasses, I went to, whether it was done, what was paid, I don't know. So I'm peculiarly detached from this question of the transition to a health service. And of course my second sister married the owner of Lazar's, the opticians in Glasgow, so that protected me from anything. In fact, I got the first set of contact lenses in Glasgow, in Scotland, I think, because Peter, I suspect he really wanted to experiment, and I was playing rugby at that time, and was blind as a bat, and played in the back row of the team. I remember playing against people like Melrose and the rest, and I couldn't see a bloody thing. And then our full-back in the game against Melrose took on Charlie Drummond, who was a famous internationalist, tried to bully him. And Tom Neal, who was a bully himself, came off worst and crocked his shoulder, and I was put to full-back. Because I was the lightest, I was only about 9 stone, 10 stone, and was playing in the back row of the forwards. I was put to full back, and the rest of the team were shouting, "Go right off, the ball's over there," because I couldn't see it. But whatever, I survived as a full back, and Peter decided I should be given contact lenses, he was the first man to introduce them in Scotland. And I stayed as a fullback all my life. So the optical work, brother-in-law, again detached from health service or consciousness, never had to dig in my pocket. And I don't know that my parents ever dug in their pockets for any of the childhood ailments or anything else, because my mother and Winnie Bruce and Norrie Bruce were such good friends. Again, I'm a useless contributor.
Do you remember visiting a dentist?
Yes, Mr. Hillier, brutal man, Great Western Road overlooking looking north and towards Buckingham Terrace. Yes, I had soft teeth. I probably had too many sweeties. Surprisingly enough, despite rationing, I always used to go into Methven's, which was my grandfather's business, and try and persuade the girls behind the counter to let me have butter kissed, which wasn't rationed. But our diet was, I don't think I really got more than my ration of sweets, which was not very much. And sugar was fairly scarce too. But I had soft teeth, so yes, I did go to the dentist and just got the normal treatment. I would not be surprised if Mr. Hillier was a family friend. I never had to pay. My parents never had to pay. And by the time I was grown up, of course, the National Health Service had come in. I'm just hoping the National Health Service, this COVID thing will result in the health service being expanded in a similar way as 1947 by having health care for the aged and residential health care made universal. I think that's wishful thinking. But again, as I say.
Ralph, could I ask you what did you do when you left school?
When I left school, I was averagely intelligent without any great speciality, but a little bit of mathematical ability. And I didn't go into the law because my family were all lawyers, my brothers, my father, and I decided to become an accountant. So I studied, became an apprentice for one of what is now the big 5 firms, and did my exams as a CA. In retrospect, I think I met 1 or 2 actuaries who are pure mathematicians, and I think that might have been a better group because I wasn't a particularly good accountant. But eventually I stayed on the profession until national service, which I did for a couple of years in the Corps of Signals. I did my usual training, applied for Far East, which failing Middle East, which failing the West Indies, which failing whatever, and was posted to Edinburgh, unfortunately. So my frustration at not following my siblings' record of travelling the world was set at naught in days when travelling abroad was pretty unusual. So I had a very undistinguished career in the signals for 2 years, came out and back to work and decided to take off in a way which was pretty unusual in those days, because I took off for the North America. The only time I'd been before abroad had been a friend who wanted to help in driving his car to the south of France. And I went down and visited with his family for a day or two. Looking back, another missed opportunity, because Sanford Young, who was another apprentice with me, his mother was Chinese. I think a second marriage had married a Scot engineer, and they lived next door to Picasso. And Mrs. Young, or Mrs. Young, I think she was by that time, was a granddaughter of Madame Chiang Kai-shek. So I was mixing and totally oblivious to all the things that happened. Sanford went back to Hong Kong after the war, after his training, and worked in Hong Kong and became a successful partner in one of the big international firms. And it was one of those interesting things to watch when China started to open up. There was negotiation regarding accounting things and everything else, standards. And it was very interesting to me to see that they did come to Hong Kong to get an expert who would help them, who was Sanford. And of course, at that time we thought the communist Mao Zedong and the rest were villains. And the thought that they would actually go to the great-grandson of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, a running dog if ever there was one, and one realised that these countries of whom we're so frightened, they're pragmatic. they live by the same rules as we do, more or less. One wouldn't believe it now when you listen to Chinese disease, the criticism which there is. But that's very much an aside. So then, as I say, I went off and toured around the States for a month or two, wandering, using no money and trying to cadge my way around. And everywhere I went in the States, I met people. They all said, the place to settle in the States is Philadelphia or Nashville or Chicago or wherever I was at the time. But with one exception, all of these people said, you go to San Francisco as their second choice. The other one was Seattle. But San Francisco in 1960, it was before the flower power, but it was a progressive, thriving, exciting city. So I wandered across I bought a beat-up Beetle and wandered across and ended up in San Francisco in a boarding house there, which was the place to go. Wandered into Pete Marwick Mitchell, as it then was, and said, do you want a Scottish accountant? And they said yes. So I spent a year, 2 years, and became a CPA in California. But again, with no great ability or facility and no great future, I don't think. But I lived life to the full in San Francisco and travelled a bit from there until I came back to Glasgow. And I'm getting beyond the 1960, but I came in, I was very lucky yet again, wandered into a small firm of accountants in Glasgow and said, I've come back from irresponsible running around the world. And they said, yes, we'll give you a job. You want to be a partner? And I said, usual. Why on earth would you? I said, we don't need to know you. You're from a good stable, which again is the influence which all of that generation had, the mutual respect of those who served together. And they knew that I came from, and mistakenly or not, they thought I was worth taking a chance. So I then had a modest career as a practicing accountant in Glasgow, until eventually we amalgamated and became part of Ernst & Young, is I think the current name. And I don't think they liked me and I didn't like them. So I retired from an undistinguished partnership and lived simply from then on. That's the end of my story. At least I hope it's not.
Tell me about your wife. When did you meet her?
Well, we're again getting beyond the 1960. What happened was that when I was working in Glasgow, I heard a lot of friends talking about sailing, and I had never sailed. So I decided to learn, and I bought a single-handed dinghy because I didn't think anybody would want to crew for me, and I didn't want to crew with anybody else. One of my friends sold me this single-handed dinghy down in Helensburgh, and he used to travel down. And as I travelled in the train, I realised that a girl with whom I wanted to be friendly travelled in the train as well. She lived in Roux, and we got more friendly, and eventually she married me. And I'd bought a house in Helensburgh, so that was 1967, and we brought up 3 kids, fortunately, healthy, all married more or less. One's married to a doctor in Paisley, consultant. One's married to a museum manager. And the other, my son, is down in London, I think married, I can't remember, with 2 young adopted kids living in Chobham. So they're all moderately settled. And we've got now 6 very happy grandchildren. We are very happy with them. About the same age as your kids. Because my eldest granddaughter, she's 23 or 24, and they don't run down from that age downwards. And they're getting on. They haven't caused any trouble yet. Although oddly enough, you'll find, I think grandchildren cause more worry, more concern, or one is more frightened for them than you were for your children. Now, whether that's because of changing environment, changing circumstances, I don't know. I don't think so, because we've always been conscious of things like drugs and other hazards of life. I mean, you couldn't live in San Francisco in 1960, 62 without being aware of drugs. But I think it is something which other grandparents have said, that I think it's also perhaps because you're not hands-on, you can't do anything about it. The last thing your children want is for you to tell them how to bring up their kids. So yes, it is not all-consuming, but it is until they reach a certain stage when you know they're on their own. And I've no doubt we'll start to worry about great-grandchildren if we're spared until that stage.
I think that's all my questions. Is there
Yeah.
anything you would like to add, Ralph?
I don't think so. I think I've gone far beyond and bored the living daylights out of all the people who have to edit it.